Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Well, hi, and welcome back to another episode of the Examine Life with Phil. I've got a special episode in format I'm doing this week where rather than doing my usual bit where I either interview somebody or do a segment, talk about an issue or two, and maybe fill it out with a Facepalm and Sigh Award segment or a segment on a philosopher or an argument for God, well, I'm just going to be doing nothing but giving out Facepalm and Sigh Awards this week. I know I'd originally said that I was going to use this week as a wrap-up for the problem of divine foreknowledge, where I was going to go through all of the 10-11 hours of material and come to kind of some summations, give my final thoughts. But, well, it's taking me quite a bit longer to go through all that material than I thought it would be. I've started that process, but it's taking quite a bit of time to do that. So that's still coming, but in the meantime, while I was going through that, started watching one of the Democratic presidential debates this week because I thought, hey, politicians are talking. This should be great material for a Facepalm and Sigh Award because anytime politicians are talking, you know they're going to say something stupid. And as I was going through, listening to all the things they had to say, hearing more and more and more and more, and yes, still more material that I could use for a Facepalm and Sigh Award, it occurred to me, why not just do a whole episode of Facepalm and Sigh Awards and point out all the pretty egregious errors in reasoning that went on at this debate? And I had that idea only during the first night of debates. There was a whole second night as well. So between the two nights, there's honestly far more material that I could give out Facepalm and Sigh Awards for than I even know what to do with. If I really wanted to go through and point out every single error, I'd probably have to have an 8 or 10 hour episode because there's really that many of them and it's really that bad. Now, generally, most people are probably not very surprised by this. I mean, people tend to get into their tribal camps over these things and quibble when it's their politician that's being attacked, but say in general that politicians make stupid, illogical, and irrational arguments, and everybody's going to agree with you. But what I'm kind of miffed about is why. Why is it that this is the case? Why aren't these politicians held to higher standards? Because they really aren't. The leaders of our countries and our civilizations should, in many senses, represent the best of us. They should be the people who we think are the most capable, the most virtuous, the most honest, the most competent. But it seems, at least in this country, we kind of look at our politicians and say, well, some people say they're the worst. I wouldn't say they're the worst because there's actual murderers and criminals that we put in prison and things like that, and those people are clearly worse than the politicians. Well, some of them. Some of the politicians, it turns out, actually are criminals, but not all of them are. Not all of them have committed crimes and murders. So those ones clearly aren't the worst. But still, you don't look at them and think, here's the best that our society has to offer. If you looked at anybody on that debate stage on Tuesday or Wednesday night and thought, here's the best our society has to offer, well, I don't mean to be rude, but I think there's something seriously wrong with your thinking, because that's clearly not true. And I'd say the same thing if you look at President Trump and think, yeah, that's the best our society has to offer. They're not the most competent. They're not the most honest. They're not the most virtuous. They're not the most capable. There's all kinds of people who are much higher in those classifications than any one of the politicians who could potentially become the next president of the U.S. And so I make all these complaints to try to make the point that even though we here in America, for very good reasons, tend to have very, very low expectations of our politicians, and some people who hear me going through and criticizing their incredibly poor use of logic and incapability of making any kind of rigorous, rational argument will say, well, so what? They're politicians. We expect that. Well, I want to counter and say, no, you shouldn't expect that. The fact that maybe the reason why, maybe at least part of the reason why we have this problem is that we have these low expectations of them, and we should hold them to a higher standard. So, to some extent, that's kind of what I'm attempting to do here. It's good and right to attempt to hold our leaders to account for their idiocy, and that's what I'm doing, because they said a lot of very idiotic and stupid things. Now, just some ground rules of how I'm doing this here. I'm not going to talk about any good and reasonable things they said. I know they did say some good and reasonable things, and it's kind of impossible when they're talking for 2 hours for them not to do that. One of my favorite philosophers, the late great Dallas Willard, said once that anybody who talks for 30 or 45 minutes is bound to say a couple of things that are profoundly wrong. I probably have quoted that on this podcast before because I like that quote so much. Well, I think you can also take that and kind of reverse it and say, even somebody who's being very stupid, has no idea how to reason, and is quite possibly being dishonest, you let them talk long enough, and they're bound to say at least one or two things that are actually right. Now, I'm not saying that they didn't say anything right. That's just not the focus of what I do with a facepalm and Sigh award. The point is to point out bad reasoning. So I'm not going to talk about good things they said. If you want to hear that, there's plenty of political pundits who you can turn into who are going to heap all kinds of praise on them, and at least some of it is probably warranted or valid. I'm not going to go after any type of what I'm going to term here hidden reasoning or philosophical assumptions that were not explicitly argued for. And what I mean by that is, I'm politically speaking, pretty aligned with the libertarians, so virtually every one of the Democratic politicians is going to have a different political philosophy than I do. And that's not my point here. I'm not going to argue that because, they think that government public aid programs are a very good idea, and I think they're a very bad idea, that therefore they're wrong. That's just kind of assumed in everything they're going from the get-go, and I don't want to get caught up in that. If you're really very interested in why I think government aid programs are a bad idea, go back and listen to episode 11, How Should We Address Poverty? I read a whole essay I did on it there. So my point here is I'm not going to get into critiquing the actual political issues. I'm just going to be critiquing the arguments that they made there. There's important debates to be had about things like public aid and abortion and things like that, and those are very good, and I wish these guys actually even attempted to have them instead of speaking in the inane, foolish ways that they do. And sometimes when you hear pundits or bloggers or commentators in the media who try to be a little bit more intellectual and thorough critique things like these debates, that's what you'll hear them turn to, is they'll say, well, the Democrats support public aid, here's all the reasons why public aid is bad, but the Democrats didn't explicitly argue for public aid in the debate, at least I didn't hear them do it, so I'm not going to critique that because they just assumed it, so I'm just critiquing the arguments they made from that assumption. I feel like I kind of muddled through that, so I hope it's kind of clear what I meant by all that. Now, I'm also not going to, or at least I'm going to try to not point out or capitalize on the things they said that are flat out false or just flat out lies. That is, I'm not going to fact check them. Again, that's not the point here. These things are bad to do, and they certainly did them, but again, that's different than simply making a bad argument. You can prove absolutely anything if you just use stupid and foolish premises. And that doesn't show you're using bad reasoning. That simply shows you're either dishonest or ignorant. So just, for example, to help you understand my point here, let's suppose that one of the Democratic candidates said something like, AR-15 rifles kill more people in this country than any other type of gun, therefore they need to be banned. Well, it's flat out not true that AR-15s kill more people than any other type of gun. Actually, it's handguns or pistols that are responsible for most gun deaths. So that would be wrong and either a lie or an example of ignorance on that candidate's part if that was said. And my point is, I'm not going to critique it if that's the case. I'm going to critique the logic of the arguments so we can all learn to reason better, because that's the point here. I don't want to get lost in political weeds, and really it's fun to go around and point out bad reasoning, especially when it's of a bunch of politicians, because politicians have it coming. So, grab yourself a cup of coffee or a good drink or something similar as I start running through all these facepalm and Sigh awards the Democrats earned. I'm going to hand them out like candy because the Democrats certainly earned a lot of them. And I know I had myself a good cup of coffee when I got started trying to record this, but then my son decided he was going to spend about an hour and a half or 2 hours screaming, and so now it's about 5 4 or 5 hours later than when I initially started the recording. And I've made it all of, looks like about 10, 12 minutes. So hopefully the next 50 minutes or so will go a little faster. We'll see. Oh, and I suppose before I get going, so I don't lose... Well, I'm sure I've already lost the partisan hacks, but so I don't lose the people who are kind of on the fence. If this was a year when the Republicans were doing a debate, I'd critique them like this too, because they'd certainly make almost all of these same logical errors, because every politician who gets on a national stage does this kind of garbage. It's not exclusive to one party. So, the most common error I heard in the debates when I was watching them there is what's called the non sequitur. And that's where someone responds in a way that simply doesn't even attempt to actually address the question or challenge that was posed at them. And this is sometimes a little similar to a red herring, wherein somebody tries to distract from the issue involved. And I'll reference a red herring later on, because there's some pretty egregious examples of that too. So I've referenced non sequiturs before in Facepalm and Sigh Awards of the Week, but they're pretty easy to understand. It'd be like if somebody came up to you and said, "Hey, where did you take your car to get it fixed?" And your response was something along the lines of, "I think healthcare is a universal right." What you responded with doesn't address the question that was asked of you at all. So a good example of this is, let's suppose I was talking to somebody and I gave them an argument like this, where I said, well, I think God exists because everything that begins to exist has a cause. We have very good philosophical and scientific reasons for thinking that the universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause, and inferring that whatever caused the universe must be distinct and separate from the universe, we're then at a cause that's very, very similar to most conceptions of God. And then suppose the person responded with, well, but in the Old Testament in the Bible, God commands a lot of people to do some very, very horrific things. Now, perhaps it's a legitimate issue what God did and didn't command people to do in the Old Testament in the Bible, but it doesn't even respond to the argument I just made. It's a complete non sequitur. And so politicians do this all the time. It's very, very common. That's one of the most common tactics they attempt to use to avoid answering questions they don't like. In fact, it happens so often that I've noticed very, very commonly in political reporting, the political reporters will attempt to cast it in a more positive light that a politician did this by saying that they're dodging the question, that they're sidestepping the question or something like that. When really, there's absolutely nothing good about it when they do this. It's an error or mistake at best, and sometimes people make error mistakes, that's okay. But most of the time when politicians do it, it's just straight up being dishonest. Now, the first three questions, or you might say interactions in the first night of the debate, all deserve Facepalm and Sigh Awards, so I'm going to kind of attempt to build on them, because they're good examples of a lot of these things. And the first one was actually a pretty clear example of a non sequitur, so I'll go ahead and play a clip of that here.
And Senator Sanders, let's start with you. You support Medicare for All, which would eventually take private health insurance away from more than 150 million Americans in exchange for government-sponsored health care for everyone. Congressman Delaney just referred to it as bad policy, and previously he has called the idea political suicide that will just get President Trump reelected. What do you say to Congressman Delaney?
You're wrong. Right now, we have a dysfunctional healthcare system, 87 million uninsured or underinsured, $500,000 Americans every year going bankrupt because of medical bills, 30,000 people dying while the healthcare industry makes tens of billions of dollars in profit. 5 minutes away from here, John, is a country. It's called Canada. They guarantee health care to every man, woman, and child as a human right. They spend half of what we spend. And by the way, when you end up in a hospital in Canada, you come out with no bill at all. Health care is a human right, not a privilege. I believe that. I will fight for that. Thank you.
Okay, so since I already went through and explained what a non sequitur is, I hope you can hear how that's Sanders' response there is just a complete non sequitur. he doesn't in any way even attempt to address the critiques of his plan or the other guy's critique that it's not viable and will only get President Trump reelected. He just goes through and starts listing various problems with the healthcare industry, about talking about how there's so many people uninsured and so on and so forth. And none of this responds in any way whatsoever to the critiques that were just made of his idea. Even when he starts declaring that healthcare is a human right, that doesn't respond to the critiques of his proposal. It's just him kind of declaring it. It's a complete non sequitur. Now, maybe, if you wanted to interpret Sanders in an ultra charitably fashion, you could then claim that his pointing to Canada is kind of a response because he seems to be kind of saying we should just copy them. And that's, well, it's not a very good response, but it's not really a non sequitur. But see, the reason why that's not a good response is then that kind of falls into something along the lines of a bandwagon fallacy or a hasty generalization fallacy. The bandwagon fallacy is sometimes it's called ad populum or argument from popularity. The idea is, well, those guys over there are doing this, so why shouldn't we? Well, there might be a bunch of very, very good reasons why you shouldn't do what those guys over there are doing, even if it looks really, really like a really, really good idea. So, quick example, suppose you've got a couple of friends who live with a very, very high standard of living. They drive very expensive cars, eat expensive food, go on expensive vacations and things along those lines. Well, does the fact that they're doing that mean you should too? Well, maybe, but what if it turns out that the way they're doing that is by going horrifically in debt, and it's going to blow up in their faces in 5 or 10 years? Well, then you probably shouldn't. And likewise, just because other countries like Canada are doing healthcare that way, it doesn't follow that we should. Maybe there's good reasons for Canada to do it, and there's good reasons for us not to, and so on and so forth. And you have to then kind of actually talk about that as opposed to just pointing at them and saying, see, they do it, we should too. And the hasty generalization fallacy is, I talked about that it was only last week now, in regards to the example of Joshua Harris. So go back and listen to that if you want a further explanation. But it's where you come to a conclusion too quickly, where you don't have all the information. And certainly pointing to only one country's healthcare system and saying, aha! Well, that's far, far too quick of a conclusion to come to. It's not considering all the other countries, it's not considering possible differences, etc., etc. It's just not a very nuanced or reasonable way to look at things. Now, Congressman Delaney argued back against Sanders, and then they gave Sanders a chance to respond, and he responded by positing a pretty clear false dilemma.
The fact of the matter is, tens of millions of people lose their health insurance every single year when they change jobs, when their employer changes that insurance. If you want stability in the healthcare system, if you want a system which gives you freedom of choice with regard to doctor or hospital, which is a system which will not bankrupt you, the answer is to get rid of the profiteering of the drug companies and the insurance companies, move to Medicare for all.
But now he's talking about a different issue.
Okay, so I'm sure you heard that he also went into a bit more of a non sequitur there, but we already covered that. I want to point out what he was saying is, if you want to improve all this, you have to do all these things to get away with profiteering and companies actually making profits and go to Medicare for all. And that's a false dilemma, because it's not an either-or thing. There might well be other options that could solve those problems. And maybe some of those problems actually involve companies making profits. Maybe some free market solutions would work. And my point here isn't arguing that they would. My point here is he's giving you a false dilemma. A false dilemma is where somebody offers you two choices when there are actually 3, 4, 5, 6, or maybe other choices to go with. So since this is involved in politics, here's a pretty clear example of a false dilemma. The media in this country would have you believe you have to be a conservative Republican or a liberal Democrat. Well, that's absolutely ridiculous. Anybody who studies these things at all knows that there's a wealth of other options. You can be socially liberal and fiscally conservative. You can be a libertarian. You could even be somebody like a communist or a Marxist if you want. There's even people, although they're very, very rare, who want some kind of theocratic government. Although I think they tend to be Muslims, but that's not a very popular position in America for obvious reasons. But the point is, there's a whole host of more options than just those two. So if somebody says to you, are you going to be a Democrat or Republican? False dilemma. And so when Sanders says, you either have this system now, which is going to make us go bankrupt and cause people to die, or you have Medicare for all, false dilemma. It's not true. There are multiple other options that could work. And the only way you could make that not be a false dilemma is to somehow establish that Medicare for all is the only other viable option, which he certainly has not done. And realistically, I don't think anybody could do that. It's far too complicated and difficult to establish something like that. Now, you'll often actually hear politicians speak in hyperbolic ways about false dilemmas like this, and I've got some more examples of this I'll show later on. Now, at this point, I don't think we're even 5-6 minutes into the actual debate yet, and we've already had two pretty good examples, and then they bring in Senator Elizabeth Warren, and she gives us some pretty good examples of various fallacies where she earns a couple of facepalm and Sigh awards herself here.
Let's be clear about this. We are the Democrats. We are not about trying to take away health care from anyone. That's what the Republicans are trying to do. And we should stop using Republican talking points in order to talk with each other about how to best provide that health care. Now, I want to have a chance to tell the story about my friend Addie Barkin. Addie is 35 years old. He has a wife, Rachel. He has a cute little boy named Carl. He also has ALS, and it's killing him. Addie has health insurance, good health insurance, and it's not nearly enough.
I'm coming right.
And I'd like to finish talking about Addie, the guy who has ALS. This isn't funny. This is somebody who has health insurance and is dying. And every month, he has about $9,000 in medical bills that his insurance company won't cover. His wife, Rachel, is on the phone for hours and hours and hours begging the insurance company, please cover what the doctors say he needs. He talks about what it's like to go online with thousands of other people to beg friends, family, and strangers for money so he can cover his medical expenses.
Okay, so I skipped over a part there where they broke away. The guy asked her a question, she responded to that, and then she came back to her the story she was telling there. So what she's done is actually give us 3 fallacies to work with here. The first is she gave us kind of it's kind of a straw man, but it's not exactly one, because she said the Republicans are trying to take away health care. Well, that's not actually true. It might be true of some Republicans in the sense that some of them are trying to or want to repeal Obamacare. But it's certainly not true of all of them. If you remember back in the first year or two of President Trump's time in office, he was trying to find out something to replace Obamacare with, either as or before they repealed it. So it's not true to say of him he's trying to get rid of your health care. It might be fair to say he's trying to replace it, he's trying to change it or something like that. And that's simply not true that that's what all Republicans want to do, as she says it is. Now, I say it's maybe a light straw man because if you looked hard enough, you might be able to find a Republican who is either in Congress or is in some kind of authoritarian position who wants to do that, but it's certainly not all of them. And then she gives a very textbook case of the genetic fallacy where she flat out says, this is Republican talking points, i.e., Delaney's criticism of Medicare for all, we should just throw it out because it's the Republican talking points. It came from the Republicans, therefore it's bad. That's a textbook case of the genetic fallacy. She's not evaluating his criticisms and showing that they're wrong. She's not saying that they're off base. She's not pointing out a logical fallacy that he made or some other mistaken error in reasoning he made. She's just saying it came from the Republicans, therefore it's wrong. This is a bit like when, say, young Earth creationists will look at a biology textbook written by an evolutionary biologist and discount everything in it because it was written by an evolutionary biologist, and they say an evolutionary biologist is not a good source, therefore everything in that textbook is wrong. That's the genetic fallacy, and that's what Warren's engaging in here. Now, she's also going into an appeal to anecdotal evidence or an appeal to pity when she starts telling that story, which is an awful story that shouldn't happen. But such a thing is not a very good argument, and it's not good evidence. And the reason why it's not is you then have to look at it and say, well, is this kind of thing a rare or one-off case, or is it the majority, or is it representative of the whole? You can't just look at various stories somebody has told you, and therefore, or that you've experienced, and say, and that's representative of the whole. Example that I ran into a bit when I was talking with some people about abortion after that episode I did on that a while back, is many of them would say, well, I know so-and-so who got an abortion because of this horrific thing in her life, or because of this bad story, or I felt like I needed one for this and this and this reason. And that's an appeal to anecdotal evidence. The facts and statistics say the vast majority of people who get abortions, something like 99%, do it for personal convenience, not for a permissible or possibly permissible reason. So even though your heart rightly should go out to the people involved in that story, she didn't establish that that actually is the normative, that is the whole. And that's why anecdotal evidence is not a good thing to go off of. That's why it's called an appeal to pity. Even though I criticized him for it earlier because it was kind of out of place, at least Sanders was giving some data and statistics you could look at, trying to say, well, this whole thing is a problem, and therefore we need to do something about it. Which, that in itself isn't bad. He was just responding in a very poor way. It was a non sequitur in his case. But in Warren's case, she hasn't even really established that there actually is a problem. She's just giving you a story to try and tug at your heartstrings and pull you in emotionally, rather than actually giving you a good argument and good data that shows her point. And the next night, some of the other candidates gave us some good examples of these fallacies as well. I'll start with Kamala Harris here.
We cannot keep with the Republican talking points on this. You got to stop.
So she actually used the exact same wording that Elizabeth Warren did. That was a phrase that seemed to catch on with the candidates, where anytime it was something that they, well, maybe not anytime, but a lot of times when it was something that they were uncomfortable with, they would try and write it off as Republican talking points, which is just the genetic fallacy. You have to actually address, why is this argument against me wrong? Show some evidence that what the person is saying is wrong. So show some error in their reasoning. Actually address what's being said. You can't just push it off because you don't like the source. And I know politicians do that all the time because, hey, the other side had the idea. You see it all the time, especially since there's so much hatred on both sides of the political spectrum these days. But it is a logical fallacy. It's a terrible way and lazy way of reading that only tells me you're either lazy intellectually or you're just flat out being dishonest. Now, also on the second debate night, the Congresswoman from Hawaii, Tulsi Gabbard, gave another example of genetic fallacy that's a little bit more sophisticated, not quite as blatant.
Now, Kamala Harris just talked about Kathleen Sebelius, who helped write her bill. This just pointed to the fatal flaw in her proposal. Sebelius works for Medicare Advantage, private insurance company who will stand to profit under her plan. If we're seeking to really reform our healthcare system, we've got to shut out big insurance and big pharma out of the drafting process so they cannot continue to profit off the backs of the sick people in this country who are searching and in desperate need of care.
Senator Harris, your response?
Well, unfortunately, Representative Gabbard got it wrong. Kathleen Sebelius did not write my plan. She endorsed it.
Okay, so Gabbard there was saying, your plan's wrong because the person who wrote it works for a private insurance company. So again, genetic fallacy there. In order for her to show that really was the case, you'd then have to dig into the meat of the plan and actually show, oh, this person had a conflict of interest in writing it, which maybe you could easily say that, but this conflict of interest caused her to put in these and these and these provisions which are bad, which profit insurance companies at the expense of the consumer or the private citizen, so on and so forth. And then you might think that Kamala Harris's response of, well, no, she didn't write it, was okay, and in a certain sense it is, because she's responding with saying, well, no, what you're saying isn't true. But she just flat out accepted the fallacious premise that if this woman, Kathleen Sebelius, had written Senator Harris's plan, then there would be something wrong with it. Really, if she was wanting to actually be rational, logical, and rigorous in her response, she should have simply said, so what if she wrote it? That doesn't show that there's anything wrong with it. Talk to me about what's actually wrong with my plan instead of trying to impugn it with a genetic fallacy. Okay, so moving on from the genetic fallacy, I think we've kind of beaten that to death now. There was also another example of a straw man on the second night, which is very, very clear and pretty blatant. And this one's from Cory Booker.
And the second thing, and this really irks me, because I heard the Vice President say that, if you got a PhD, you can come right into this country. Well, that's playing into what the Republicans want, to pit some immigrants against other immigrants. Some are from country, and some are from worthy countries.
So Booker is quite clearly mischaracterizing what the Republican immigration proposals and what President Trump's immigration proposals are. And he's being a little clever. Well, no, it's not really clever. What am I searching for? It's ironic. It's ironic that he would turn around and use President Trump's own language then against President Trump. But it's a very clear mischaracterization of what President Trump's actual proposals on immigration are and what Republican proposals on immigration are, which isn't, hey, we like people from this country and we don't like people from this country. Rather, it's, hey, let's let in people who can demonstrate some merit, who have some education or some skill or some other way that they can show us that they're going to be of value and of use to the society and the country here, rather than just willy-nilly letting people in or using a lottery system like often happens now. Now, again, this is one of those things where I think you could probably debate the merits of some of that point, and there might even be some good arguments that could be made against that type of immigration policy. But Cory Booker didn't do that. He just completely mischaracterized it. And that's a straw man fallacy, because he's misrepresenting his opponent's viewpoint in order to make it easier for him to beat up on it. He doesn't actually have to do the work of critiquing it if he can just write it off as stupid and racist like he wants to do. Okay, so the next bit here is a compilation from the first night where many of them were talking about gun control. And they all committed equivocation on a couple of phrases here. So I'm going to play the clip here and listen to what you think they might be equivocating on, and then at the end of the clip I'll tell you what it is.
Mayor Buttigieg, other than offering words of comfort, what are you specifically going to do to stop this epidemic of gun violence?
Well, this epidemic of gun violence has hit my community too, far too many times. It's the worst part of being mayor, getting the phone call, consoling grieving parents. And we have a mass shootings worth of killings every day in this country. What we're doing hasn't worked because we haven't had a system in Washington capable of delivering what the American people have told us they want. 80-90% of Republicans want universal background checks, not to mention the common sense solutions like red flag laws that disarm domestic abusers and flag mental health risks, and an end to assault weapons, things like what I carried overseas in uniform that have no business in American neighborhoods in peacetime, let alone anywhere near a school.
Well, this is the fundamental nonsense of government. Another place where, despite our best efforts, we can't seem to make any progress. And we passed, as a purple state, we passed universal background checks. We limited magazine capacity. We did the basic work that, for whatever reason, doesn't seem to be able to get done in Washington.
Thank you, Governor. Senator Klobuchar, please respond.
This isn't just about a system, or it's not just about words. This is about the NRA. I will make sure that we get universal background checks passed, the assault weapon ban, that we do something about magazines. The people are with us now. After Parkland, those students just didn't march. They talked to their dads and their grandpas and the hunters in their family, and they said there must be a better way. Then we elected people in the House of Representatives, and guess what? It changed, and they passed universal background checks. And now that bill is sitting on Mitch McConnell's doorstep because of the money and the power of the NRA.
Back in 1988, coming from a state that had no gun control, I called for the ban of the sale and distribution of assault weapons. I lost that election. I will do everything I can, not only to take on the NRA, but to expand and create universal background checks, do away with the straw man provision, do away with the gun show loophole.
Okay, so I hope that's the longest clip I have to play for you in this podcast here. I had to relocate. My wife came home while I was recording, and now I have to relocate to another room. So this is now the third break in this podcast now. You might be able to hear the difference due to the different acoustics in this room. I hope it isn't too jarring. So anyhow, they actually equivocated on two terms there. That is, they equivocated on assault rifle and they equivocated on universal background checks. Now, equivocation is, I'm pretty sure I've talked about this before in the podcast, it's where you use a word that can mean multiple things and you don't clearly define what you mean. It's very easy to see it in this simple argument that I like to use for this, which is, say, I have a cat that likes sitting on mats. I have a friend named Matt. Therefore, my cat will like to sit on my friend. Now, there's clear equivocation there because in one sense, mat is being used to refer to a piece of cloth that sits on the ground, and in another sense, it's being used to refer to a person because it's a person's name. And so that's a bad argument because there's equivocation going on there. Now, the reason there's equivocation going on with these terms like assault rifle and universal background checks is they actually mean very different things to different people, and none of them bothered to define it, with one exception, which is Pete Buttigieg compared assault rifles to the kind of thing that he carries overseas, but that's actually dishonest. This is a common problem in discussions about gun control that I've been talking about for at least a couple of years now, and that's that the vast majority of people who are talking about it simply have no idea what they're talking about. In the case of these politicians, I think it's more likely that they're being dishonest and purposely being vague and equivocating rather than that they don't know what they're talking about. But if you're talking to your friends or family, that might well not be the case. So, if somebody's talking about assault rifles or military-style weapons in regards to gun control in America, I think they've just demonstrated that they don't know what they're talking about, or in the case of Buttigieg, they're being dishonest. If I'm debating philosophy with someone and they can't even get their terms right, then I know they don't know very much about philosophy. Now, in one sense, there's nothing wrong with just not knowing very much about a subject matter if you're looking to use the discussion to, say, further your knowledge and discuss ideas. But there's something seriously wrong if, say, I'm debating philosophy and this person I'm debating it with keeps declaring that epistemic realism is certainly false, and then when I talk to them some more, it becomes very clear that they have little or no idea what epistemic realism actually is. So the term assault rifle actually doesn't have a very good or well-defined definition. It's not like rifle or handgun. It's very obvious what a handgun is. It's very obvious what a rifle is. Assault rifle has in fact become an umbrella term that pretty much always means whatever the speaker has in mind at that particular moment. All this demonstrates is that the speaker has about as much knowledge of firearms as I do of agricultural practices in ancient China. Now, the one definition that I've been able to find of this is from the U.S. Army, which I think is a pretty good source for definitions on weapons, and it says that assault rifles are short, compact, selective fire weapons that fire a cartridge intermediate in the power between a submachine gun and rifle cartridges, i.e. submachine guns are smaller automatic or semi-automatic weapons that fire quickly, and rifles fire larger weapons. So an assault rifle, according to the U.S. Army, is a kind of an intermediate weapon that has selective fire. Now, that would mean AR-15s are not assault rifles because they do not have selective fire. You can't switch between semi-automatic and automatic fire on them because they don't have automatic fire, and that's what selective fire means, is you can change the mode of fire if you want to. Now, realistically in the U.S., the laws vary a little bit from state to state, and there are a couple of exceptions. But the vast majority of automatic weapons are illegal and have been for quite some time. So you actually can't legally get most, with a few exceptions, a selective fire weapon. So when Buttigieg was talking about how people shouldn't carry weapons like he carried overseas, he was flat out being dishonest, or he's very ignorant, because for the vast majority of people, the vast majority of the time, You're not going to get that kind of weapon in this country. You cannot go to the local gun store and buy one that's like that. It's illegal to do. And again, there are a couple of exceptions. The few remaining legal automatic weapons were grandfathered in when automatic weapons were made illegal. And they're now quite rare and quite expensive because they're rare. Economics took over. And so it's actually much cheaper and easier for you to take a semi-automatic weapon and go on the internet and find ways to modify it into an automatic weapon, which makes it illegal. So when I hear these politicians talking about assault rifles, I know one of two things. They don't know what they're talking about and haven't taken time to educate themselves on this issue. They're just parroting political talking points, or, well, I guess it's one of three things, because the third option is they're just flat out being dishonest. Now, this is not just a semantic thing, because it's quite important to be very, very clear in policy and legislation. It needs to be specific and precise. Vague and ambiguous laws and policies very rarely help, and they often make things much worse. So picking on Buttigieg again, he equated assault rifles, with the type of rifle he carried when he was in the military, because he's a veteran like I am. Well, that would mean any law he's passed or supported as president, anything he pushed through, would ban things that are effectively already banned in about 99% of the cases. So it'd be a pretty worthless law. Maybe he'd get to feel good about himself and pat himself and some other people on the back, but it would accomplish absolutely nothing. And that's why you need to be vague and that's why you need to be precise and specific when you're talking about these things. And I hope you can see here, that's what the fallacy of equivocation is. Now, the reason why they're equivocating on universal background checks is because they're not really defining what that actually is. It does sound very good, and when you poll people and ask if they're in favor of universal background checks, I believe the vast majority do in fact say, well, yes, of course. But then when you actually spell out what universal background checks would entail, the number of people who support it goes down dramatically. Now, it already is the case that if you're going to buy a weapon of any kind legally anywhere in the U.S., you're pretty much going to have to go through a background check. That is, if you walked into a store, buy one, you have to go through a background check. There's, again, the laws on it will vary a little from state to state, but generally speaking, anywhere you walk in and say, I want to buy a weapon, you're going to have to do that. Now, the reason they're saying it's not universal is you don't have to go through a background check if you know a friend of yours who has a couple of rifles, he's looking to offload one, and you say, hey, I'll buy that off you, and it's just a private transaction between the two of you. The government has no way of tracking those things, so nobody has to go through a background check for those type of transactions. So when they say universal background checks, most of the time what they mean is we need to get background checks on those types of private party to private party transactions. The reason why support goes down dramatically when people realize that's what they're talking about is there's only really two ways to do that. The first way is you'd have to make a national registry of some kind that lists all the firearms in the country so the government could keep track of them and know when they're being transferred and then enforce it. The second way is, which would not be very effective, is you'd have to require every time there's a private party to private party transaction of a weapon like that, that the two of them go to like a local government office, the courthouse or something, register that transaction, and the person receiving the weapon goes through a background check, which that would be pretty difficult to enforce for obvious reasons. And people get very, very suspicious, given this country's history, of any kind of the government making any kind of a list of weapons because, well, they're thinking, what happens if a tyrannical government takes over one day? They're going to have a list of everybody who's got weapons. We don't want that. And so that's why when they're equivocating when they say everybody most people favor universal background checks. When you actually define what it would mean and what it would entail, the support goes way, way, way down, because it would require adding another whole big bureaucratic layer to the government at either the federal or the state level, and it would require the government operating some more control over people's firearms and people's lives, and most people don't want that. Now, if they were being honest, these Democrats would go through and fess up to that and say, yeah, one of these two options is what we should do, it's what I think is best, and here's why, and they'd argue for it. But they're not. And in this case, it's not, I don't think it's unintentional equivocation. Unintentional equivocation happens in conversations with people all the time. When you use a word and it means something different to somebody else, that's unintentional equivocation. It's a problem for communication, but it's not like you made a moral error when that happens. In this case, I'm pretty suspicious of any claim that they would make that they didn't realize what they were doing. They almost certainly know exactly what they're saying, and they phrased it in that vague and ambiguous and equivocal way on purpose, because they know if they actually spelled out what they really wanted to do, their support would go way, way down. So moving on to another type of fallacy, I'm going to pick on Pete Buttigieg. He criticized some people who were holding up some laws on the minimum wage, and listen to how he did it.
The minimum wage is just too low. And so-called conservative Christian senators right now in the Senate are blocking a bill to raise the minimum wage when Scripture says that whoever oppresses the poor taunts their maker.
Mayor, thank you very much.
Okay, I hope you could hear there that that's a clear case of the ad hominem fallacy. That is, he's not talking about, hey, this is why we need to have this minimum wage law, this is why it's a good thing, this is why it helps the poor people. He's criticizing the people who are holding it up in the Senate for being hypocrites. He's saying, you claim to be Christians, your scriptures say this, therefore you're hypocrites, how dare you hold this up? At no point did he actually argue as to why it's a good thing and why it shouldn't be held up. He just said, the people who oppose this are hypocrites, therefore I'm right. And what's really dumb here is he could have made this into a positive appeal, where instead of trying to insult and demean his political opponents, he could have just appealed to them as Christians. He claims to be a Christian, which, okay, so he could have said, hey, we follow the Christ, and Christ said you need to look after the poor. I believe this minimum wage bill will help look after the poor for these and these and these reasons. You should come support it with me because we're following the teachings of Christ. Now, that would have been an appeal that actually wasn't attacking people. It would have been an invitation. It would have been, rather than excluding them, saying you're hypocrites, it would have been saying, hey, come with me and we can do this together, which actually is much more in line with how Christ often spoke to people. So, no surprise, there were quite a few instances of ad hominem in these debates, because politicians love to just demonize the other side instead of actually deal with arguments or issues. And here are two of them that I'll just string together real quick.
We can no longer allow a white nationalist to be in the White House.
The first thing that I'm going to do when I'm president is I'm going to Clorox the Oval Office.
So moving on from ad hominem, now I'm going to give some examples where it's not as perfectly obvious and clear what the fallacy is, whether maybe there's a mix of several ones or it's a little harder to see. And these ones are always much more interesting. I mean, it can be fun to point it out when politicians make obvious logical errors, but it's a lot more fun to pull apart the ones where there's something wrong, but it's not quite clear what it is. So now I'm going to get into some examples of that, and I'm going to start with one from Bernie Sanders first.
If a mother and a child walk thousands of miles on a dangerous path, in my view, they are not criminals.
So just in case it's not clear, he was talking about immigration there. And he made a pretty obvious argument, which is a if-then statement. If a mother and a child walk thousands of miles to get here, therefore they're not criminals. Then they're not criminals. But that's a pretty absurd, it seems on the face of it to be a pretty absurd argument. So let's suppose a mother and child who, the mother's pretty high up in one of the drug cartels, and for some reason or other she has to walk a couple thousand miles to get to the U.S. Does that make her suddenly not a criminal? Well, no, of course not. The trouble here is that Sanders is mixing categories. How far a person has walked has absolutely nothing to do with their legal status, with whether or not they've broken the law. This is sometimes called the fallacy of a false analogy, because the one really has nothing to do with the other. And I think what he was maybe trying to get at there, again, try to find ways to interpret him charitably if we can, is that, well, if somebody's willing to go through all this effort to get here, then they couldn't be a criminal. Look at everything these people sacrificed to get here. You know, there's comparing it to the stories of how much immigrants from Europe suffered to get over to the U.S. back in like the late 1800s, early 1900s, that kind of thing. But again, that just has absolutely nothing to do with whether or not somebody's a criminal. Criminals and people who are pretty awful will often suffer through quite a bit of things to meet their ends. That doesn't make them not criminals. So the fact that a mother and her child walked thousands of miles to get to the U.S., it doesn't make them not a criminal. The one has nothing to do with the other. Now here's an example of a different type of fallacy where Joe Biden was talking to Julian Castro, and Castro worked with Biden in the Obama administration. I forget exactly what his position was. He was in President Obama's cabinet, and I'm sure somebody will be able to tell me what position he had, but I don't recall at the top of my head. So anyhow, that's the context of this little exchange they're going to make here.
I found that the secretary, we sat together in many meetings. I never heard him talk about any of this when he was the secretary.
Okay, this is another example of the type of rhetoric you often hear in politics, which is, hey, I'd worked with this guy for years. Why didn't he say anything about this then? Why didn't he do anything about this then? President Trump and the Republicans had complete control of government for 2 years. Why didn't they do their tax cuts and their border wall then? And really, this is an example of a red herring, which is it's not dealing with the topic at all. It's a deliberate distraction from it. This is named for the fish, a red herring, for back when they used bloodhounds to track things more often. Somebody might come along and take an actual red herring fish and smear it all over the trail to get the bloodhound off the trail. It's meant as a distraction. Now, this is very similar to the non sequitur type of fallacy that I opened up with. The difference is pretty much with intention. When you're using a red herring, it's with the intention of dodging away from the issue in question, diverting attention. With a non sequitur, it's kind of more like you think it's a response, but it's not. It's more like a kind of an unintentional error. At least, they're pretty similar, so sometimes it's kind of hard to tell them apart. So in this case, Castro was criticizing Biden for some stuff, and Biden's response was, well, why didn't you talk to us about this when we were both working for President Obama? Which doesn't address any of the criticism. It's a deflection. It's a way of trying to avoid things. It's a red herring. Okay, and here's Cory Booker again, and listen close, see if you can figure out what the errors he's making here are.
This is a case for the Democratic Party. The truth will set us free. We lost the state of Michigan because everybody from Republicans to Russians were targeting the suppression of African American voters. We need to say that.
So this is another case where it might be a little hard for you to pick up on it at first, because especially if you're on the left side of the spectrum, because that's something that's been harped over and over and over again for the past couple of years is, oh, they suppressed the vote and that's why we lost. Now, I don't think that's true, but let's suppose for a second that there even was some legitimate and reasonable evidence that that was the case. He still made a logical error here, and that's the error of hasty generalization, which is he's saying the reason the Democrats lost Michigan to President Trump is because the Russians and the Republicans suppressed the vote. When the reality is there could have been any number of other reasons why that happened. It could be because Hillary Clinton barely even campaigned in that state, and Donald Trump campaigned a lot there. That could have been the reason why a lot of normal Democratic voters stayed home, because they thought, well, why get out for somebody who didn't even come and campaign? She didn't go there and get them excited, so they didn't come out. Where Donald Trump went there and got a lot of people excited, so they came out for him. Now, I don't know that that's entirely the reason why either. I'd be making a hasty generalization if I said that. My point here is that Booker's claiming voter suppression is the reason why us Democrats lost Michigan. And he doesn't know that. He doesn't make a good argument for that. It's a hasty generalization. And in this case, I strongly suspect he's not even able to see the error in his reasoning there, but due to his own narrative bias. And I had a whole episode on narrative bias if you want to look into it. In this particular case, I think a lot of Democrats are suffering from horrific narrative bias where they're desperately searching for any kind of explanation as to why they lost the 2016 election that doesn't require them to admit that they did some things wrong and they had a candidate who did some things wrong. Okay, so now I'm going to play a couple of clips that I'm going to string a couple of them together. These are from Kamala Harris, Joe Biden, and the Washington Governor Jay Inslee, and they all commit the same type of error, so just going to run through them all quickly.
The cost of doing nothing is far too expensive.
8 more years of Donald Trump will change America in a fundamental way. The America we know will no longer exist.
The people in this room and the Democrats watching tonight are the last best hope for humanity on this planet.
So in this case, the error is called the eschatology fallacy. Now, eschatology is the study of the end times, the study of the end of the world. So loosely speaking, this is when somebody says to you, you have to do this or we're all going to die. You have to do this or it's the end of the world. You have to do this or it's the worst thing ever, which is what all of them were saying. It's kind of a derivative of the slippery slope fallacy where things are going to get worse and worse if you don't do this. If you don't put a stop to this problem now, it's going to come back and bite us eventually. That's called the slippery slope fallacy, and this is kind of an extreme version of that. And the reason why this is a fallacy is you often don't know that that's actually the case. I mean, there are things that would end the world. If somebody was running for office who said, the minute I get into the White House, I'm going to order us to launch all our nukes, well, in that case, it wouldn't be a fallacy if people said, don't vote for him, look what he's going to do, he's going to end the world. But realistically speaking, for pretty much everybody else almost all the time, you don't actually know that that's what's going to happen. You don't know that Donald Trump getting reelected would be the worst possible thing that could happen to this country. Just as I, as someone who's very unlikely to vote for any of these Democrats, I don't know that one of them getting elected would be the worst possible thing that could happen, that would bring about the end of the country or fundamentally change things in horrible ways. It could be they get into office and the checks and balances work so they don't get to do anything they want to do. Could be they get into office and they make a change or two that everybody doesn't like and the whole country rises up against them and votes them out of office, or anything similar to that. And that's why it's a fallacy, because you don't know that that's what's going to happen. And this is also kind of an appeal to pity or appeal to rhetoric, in that politicians use this all the time to get people excited, to get them on board with what they're doing without actually thinking about it. In fact, I think this is actually maybe one of the causes of most of the problems in our politics today, is the Republicans view the Democrats as so catastrophic, and the Democrats view the Republicans as so catastrophic that they're both willing to say and do things that they know are immoral and wrong to prevent the rise of the other. It's consequentialist ethics run amok, and this is getting into other territory, but I'll try to explain briefly. Consequentialist ethics is where you judge the moral rightness or wrongness of an action strictly by its consequences. So, when you got a new job, did that increase your happiness and the goodness in your life and the lives of others? If the answer is yes, it was a good thing. If the answer is no, it was a bad thing. And you can see how maybe it kind of works in a case like that. But the problem is, once you move that into politics, if you view the other side as a horrific evil, somebody comparable to, say, Hitler, Stalin, or Chairman Mao, well, then you're going to feel like you're justified in doing all kinds of things that would otherwise be horrific to stop them. Because is it justifiable to murder a couple of people to stop the rise of Hitler? Now, I think you should say no, but a lot of people would probably want to say yes. You could trade a couple of lives for 50 million. And that's what happens when you get into consequentialist ethics run amok. The Democrats are so horribly convinced that President Trump is evil that they're willing to say and do things that they flat out know are dishonest and wrong to prevent him, because they view him as comparable to something like Hitler or Stalin, which is ridiculous. He hasn't murdered anybody or done genocide, at least not as far as I'm aware. If there's any serious allegations that he's murdered people, then it's a different matter. Conversely, many Republicans view a lot of the Democrats with the same disdain, so they're willing to do and say things that they would otherwise regard as immoral to prevent that rise of greater evil. And that's why consequentialist ethics doesn't work, and kind of an extended discussion as to why you should point out the eschatology fallacy and avoid it. If a politician says to you, we have to stop them, they're evil, immediately be suspicious of them. Say, prove to me that they're evil. If it was something like the politician says, we have to stop them, they're murdering all kinds of people, and he can show you good evidence that they're murdering people, well, that's a different matter. But these Democratic politicians didn't do that. It was just, Trump is evil, therefore we have to stop him. It's not good reasoning. It's a terrible way of doing things, and I'm reasonably convinced, at least partially responsible for why our politics has become so bad. Now, here's another one that's mixed. It's where it's not entirely clear what the fallacy is, and fortunately, this one is actually kind of entertaining as well.
We need to do the opposite of much of what we're doing right now, and the opposite of Donald Trump is an Asian man who likes math.
So that was Andrew Yang, who's one of the candidates who some people like but doesn't seem to be getting much attention from the media, and that's a really good line. I genuinely laughed when I heard that. It's clever. But it's obviously not valid. There's a couple different ways you could look at it. You could say that maybe it's a false dilemma because saying we need to do the opposite of Donald Trump or Donald Trump, well, that's not true necessarily. There's, again, a whole host of other options you could pick. It's at least theoretically possible that you could find somebody who has more or less the same policies as Trump, who's not a jerk to everybody, or maybe you could find somebody who's a jerk and has opposite policies from Donald Trump, which, from what I've heard, Andrew Yang has a pretty good reputation. I don't think he's a jerk. So you don't necessarily have to go with the opposite, so it's kind of a false dilemma. You might want to say it's kind of a hasty generalization because an Asian man who likes math, that's not necessarily the opposite. Maybe it would be an Asian woman who likes math. That's much more of an opposite than Donald Trump. And there's a couple other ways you could kind of categorize that. The point is, it's a good rhetorical line in that it is funny, but it's in no sense any type of valid reasoning. Okay, so I'll start wrapping up here now. There's a whole host of other problems and facepalm awards I could have given out here because it really was very, very bad. I finished looking through all these and thought, man, these people are all fools, and it's just so incredibly disheartening that there's a fairly decent chance one of these people might be the next president of the U.S. and literally have control over nuclear weapons. The way I see it, you're kind of left with a dilemma in which there's really only one of two ways in which you can take this. When you're looking at the individual politicians who speak this way and act this way and keep doing and saying these stupid things that are obviously wrong, that are obviously not good reasoning, well, you can either say these people are fools who don't understand what they're saying. They're so hyper wrapped up in the politics and the rhetoric and surrounded by yes men and their bubbles where people just tell them what they want to hear, that they really don't understand what they're saying, which is entirely possible. In which case these people are kind of fools, and not the kind of person who you would ever want running anything. I wouldn't want a person like that being in charge of my local school board, much less the country. Or you have to turn around and say, these people know exactly what they're doing, they understand exactly what they're saying, and they're being dishonest with you. They're not being straight. And either option is pretty horrifically bad, because either they're fools or they're dishonest. And I really don't see another option in the case of people who speak like that. Now, I'm not going to necessarily say that everybody who was involved in these debates is a fool or dishonest. I mean, some of them I didn't give facepalm and Sigh awards to, but again, I didn't go through and meticulously cite everyone, so I'm sure you can find errors in everyone who was there. So as I'm wrapping up here, I've got an idea or two about why does this happen? Why is the debate quality of these things so poor? And I think part of the answer is that these aren't real debates. They're 30, 40-second sound bites. They're not debates where the politicians get to go back and forth on ideas. They're not debates in the sense where ideas are considered, their merits are evaluated, and they're promoted or knocked down. I've watched debates like that before in both academic and non-academic settings, and usually it is somebody says, here's my idea, here's my reasons for it, here's my evidence. Somebody else comes back and says, that's a bad idea, here's where your evidence is lacking, and or here's where your reasoning doesn't work. The other person says, no, I think it is still a good idea, you might have had a point or two here or there, but this reasoning actually does work, this evidence actually is valid, and they go back and forth like that. That's an actual debate. And none of these presidential debates, none of the political debates in our country where the candidates actually participate are ever like that. You can kind of make a little bit of an excuse in early primary ones like this, wherein how on earth would they organize something like that when you've got, like 8 or 10 people involved in each one and you've only got 2 hours? That'd be pretty impossible. But you don't even see that when it's in the presidential race and you get down to just 2 candidates. They still go back and forth on 30, 40 seconds. Maybe they get up to a minute or 2 sound bites, but they're still not actually debating ideas or merits. They're just going back and forth like this, trying to out-ironic or out-clever each other. They're not actually debating ideas. Now, debates that are more academic and more back and forth like that, they're not perfect means for evaluating ideas and things like that, but they're certainly better than what's being done now. So why isn't it being done that way now? Well, I think part of the problem is actually the media that wants those sound bites, that actually has a vested interest in keeping these debates shallow because they want to do their 5, maybe 6 or 7 minute segment and then on their news show that they can put up on YouTube that doesn't really dive into anything but gets people excited so they watch it and click more. And I know I said I wasn't going to do anything promoting like good things they said, but Andrew Yang actually had a very good quote talking about this.
You know what the talking heads couldn't stop talking about after the last debate? It's not the fact that I'm somehow number 4 on the stage in national polling. It was the fact that I wasn't wearing a tie. Instead of talking about automation in our future, including the fact that we automated away 4 million manufacturing jobs, hundreds of thousands right here in Michigan, we're up here with makeup on our faces and our rehearsed attack lines, playing roles in this reality TV show. It's one reason why we elected a reality TV star as our president.
And so I actually pretty much agree with Yang here. I think he's right that the quality of discourse is very, very, very low. Now, I wasn't alive 50, 60 years ago. I don't know if it was better then or if it's worse now. But I know it's bad now. And I know part of the way we could make it better is by telling politicians, no, you're using bad reasoning. No, that's a stupid argument. No, you're supposed to be our leader. What's wrong with you that you can't make a coherent, sensible argument for your position? There's something really wrong about the fact that I, as a libertarian philosopher, can make better arguments for many of the positions the these Democratic candidates are fighting for than they did on a national debate stage. And that's not just because I'm a philosopher and trained in arguments. Really, they should be the ones trying to convince me when I can make their arguments better. That's how bad political discourse is. And that's part of the reason why I wanted to do this podcast, so to speak, calling them out on it. Now, I'm under no illusion that any of those candidates are going to listen to my podcast and take heart to it. I'd be very shocked if any of them did, much less if they listened and then changed their behavior and started using good arguments, because it's far more likely they'd try to use their rehearsed attack lines on me and diminish me rather than actually taking any of this criticism to heart. But if more and more of us do this, if more and more of us say to our politicians and our leaders, no, give us some good reasons instead of rhetoric. No, stop telling us the world is going to end if you don't get it your way. And if you really think it is going to end if you don't get your way, at least explain to us why, and things along those lines. I think that would do a step toward making it better. So, to start wrapping up this episode, I'm not going to go back through and name every Democratic candidate who I went through in this episode, because there were so many, but let's just say I'm giving them all a facepalm and Sigh Word of the Week, because they all did some pretty egregious and stupid reasoning that is worthy of being called out. And they all should know better, because all of them are vying to be the leader of the most powerful nation that has ever existed in the history of mankind. So we need to hold them to a higher standard than that. So, now, what do you think? Do you think this was a good idea, a good format for the episode? I kind of had fun going through it. I really enjoy going through, dissecting their bad reasoning and pointing it out. Do you think it's a bad way to do things? Do you want me to go back to doing something a little less topical, a little less political? Write and let me know what you think. As always, you can reach me at theexaminedlifewithphil@gmail.com, and you can feel free to leave comments on the Facebook page, The Examined Life with Phil. So, that's all for this week, and I'll be back again next week.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.